On a warm afternoon in late spring, the river was alive with its usual rhythm, shimmering currents weaving between smooth stones, the steady hum of insects in the air, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. Families often came here to cast lines into the water or let their children skip rocks across the glassy current. Among them that day was a young boy and his family. They carried a cooler, a few folding chairs, and the expectation of nothing more than a quiet few hours by the bank. For the boy, it was a small adventure, a chance to chase minnows in the shallows and compete with his older brother to see whose stone could hop the farthest. The details of those early hours are clear because they seemed so ordinary. The boy's father baited hooks and helped his daughter untangle her fishing line. His mother laid out sandwiches, occasionally glancing over to where her youngest moved along the edge of the water. Witnesses later recalled he was laughing, shirt slightly damp from leaning too close to the current. No one imagined these moments would become the final memories of him alive. What happened next unfolded quickly, almost invisibly. The boy was last seen crouched near the water, his small hands reaching for a flat stone he intended to send across the surface. His sister turned away for only a few seconds, distracted by the tug on her fishing line. When she looked back, he was gone. At first, there was no panic, just confusion. The family assumed he had wandered a few feet upstream or slipped into the nearby trees. They called out his name, expecting to hear a playful answer. The silence that followed cut deeper with every second. The search began instinctively. His father waded into the river up to his waist, eyes scanning the water, convinced the boy might be just beneath the surface. His mother ran up the trail toward the car, shouting desperately as if he had somehow returned there on his own. The siblings circled the area, their voices rising in pitch with each unanswered call. Within minutes, nearby anglers and picnickers joined, spreading out along the banks, peering through brush, bending down to look under the dock. By the time the first call reached emergency services, the family's fear had already escalated into something close to terror. Paramedics and local deputies arrived quickly, sirens briefly breaking the stillness before fading into the sound of rushing water and frantic voices. They organized a rapid response, marking sections of the bank with cones, assigning search patterns, and ordering divers into the river. For those watching, the scale of the response only intensified the dread. The current that day was deceptively strong. Divers struggled as the river pulled against them, visibility clouded by mud and silt stirred from the bottom. Volunteers linked arms in shallow stretches, moving slowly to feel for anything beneath the surface. Officers extended the search to wooded trails, convinced the boy might have wandered inland. Every theory was entertained because every possibility felt equally desperate. Hours dragged on, sunlight shifting toward evening. Neighbors gathered at the scene, some holding lanterns, others simply standing in shock. The boy's mother refused to leave the water's edge, her clothes soaked from kneeling too close, calling out until her voice broke. His father kept moving, first in circles along the bank, then farther into the woods, as though sheer effort might bring his son back into view. When the first night fell, reality began to settle in. Emergency lights cast long shadows over the river, a haunting contrast to what had begun as an ordinary family outing. Deputies set up a command post, coordinating shifts through the darkness. The river became both enemy and witness, holding answers just beyond reach. The family was escorted to a relative's house to rest, though none of them could truly sleep. The image of that empty stretch of water stayed fixed in their minds. By dawn the next morning, the boy was still missing. What had begun as an innocent day by the river had shifted into a nightmare that no one could yet explain. For the family, hope fought with dread in equal measure, but the silence of the river offered no comfort. And as the hours turned into days, the question of what had happened to him on that riverbank would only deepen, drawing the entire community into a mystery that would not let go. The morning after the boy's disappearance, the riverbank was transformed into a command center. Patrol cars lined the dirt road, radios crackled with updates, and deputies stretched caution tape across the area where the family had been fishing. The search began with methodical urgency, a stark contrast to the frantic, uncoordinated efforts of the night before. Officers divided the riverbank into grids, assigning volunteers and responders to comb through every patch of brush, every trail, every inlet that might have concealed a child. The hope was simple. If he had wandered off, he could still be found alive. Divers entered the water at first light. The current was cold and fast, the river swollen from recent rains. They swept along the bottom with outstretched arms, feeling for clothing, hair, or any sign of a body. Each time they surfaced with nothing but mud and debris, the family's hope shifted between relief and dread. Cadaver dogs were brought in, noses pressed low to the earth, pulling handlers toward the reeds. At moments, the dogs signaled strongly near the water's edge, but the scent dissipated quickly, lost in the churn of the river. Investigators fanned out to gather witness accounts. Fishermen remembered seeing the boy crouched near the bank, skipping stones. A woman walking her dog claimed she spotted him on the trail leading into the woods, though her timeline conflicted with others. Another local thought they saw a small figure near a parked vehicle by the dirt access road, but admitted they couldn't be certain. These contradictions frustrated detectives. Every account seemed to point in a different direction, into the river, into the trees, or toward the road. Each possibility carried its own grim implications. By the third day, the search had expanded miles beyond the original site. Helicopters swept over the forest canopy, deputies knocked on doors of nearby cabins, and boats dragged sonar across the deeper sections of the river. Still, no trace of the boy appeared. No torn clothing, no shoes, no small body caught against a log jam. The absence of evidence was as unsettling as any discovery might have been. Parents of other children in the town began to worry aloud. Was this an accident or something far darker? For the boy's family, the search blurred into a relentless cycle of waiting and watching. His mother stood each day at the edge of the river, whispering his name as if it might pull him back. His father joined the searchers, stomping through waist-high grass and calling out until his voice cracked. The siblings lingered in silence, too young to fully understand, yet old enough to sense that life had shifted into something unrecognizable. Meals went untouched, nights were sleepless, their home filled with the sound of unanswered phones and the constant shuffle of relatives and neighbors trying to offer comfort. Authorities continued to hold press briefings, insisting that every available resource was being used. Still, beneath their measured words lay the quiet admission that time was running out. Survival experts reminded them that if the boy had wandered into the woods, exposure and dehydration would already be life-threatening. If he had slipped into the river, the chances of recovery alive were almost non-existent after the first 24 hours. These realities were never spoken aloud to the family, but they hovered in every conversation. As the first week ended, frustration began to surface. Volunteers questioned why search areas were repeated, why promising leads weren't producing results. Detectives bristled at rumors spreading through town that perhaps the boy had been taken, that someone in the community knew more than they were admitting. Each new whisper added another layer of doubt, making it harder to separate fact from speculation. The second week brought exhaustion. Search parties dwindled, replaced by smaller, more focused teams. Sonar scans were conducted again, this time with advanced equipment, yet the river offered only silence. Dogs were rotated in from different agencies, but their alerts remained inconclusive, pulled downstream by currents impossible to pin down. Detectives revisited witnesses, pressing for consistency, but the stories remained stubbornly fragmented. Some believed he drowned, some believed he was abducted, and others thought he was still wandering somewhere unseen. By the end of the third week, reality was undeniable. The boy had vanished without, leaving a single definitive trace. The river seemed to mock their efforts, swallowing any evidence and carrying it away. His family faced the cruel shift from searching for a child to waiting for a body. The official search scaled back, though officers promised the case remained open. For those left standing on the muddy banks, it felt less like an ending and more like falling into an endless void. The river had taken its secret and refused to return it, and in that silence, questions began to fester, questions that would linger for years, until nature itself, more than a decade later, would force the river to give up what it had buried all along. In the weeks that followed the failed search, the vacuum left by unanswered questions quickly filled with speculation. At first, most people clung to the simplest explanation, that the boy had slipped on the slick mud and been pulled under by the river's current. It was the narrative that fit the setting, the story that allowed people to look at the water and believe it had claimed him in a tragic accident. The authorities leaned in this direction as well, though their certainty was undercut by a glaring absence. A body should have surfaced within days. Downstream nets and sonar sweeps should have recovered something. Instead, the river gave back nothing. That silence planted doubt. For many in the community, doubt grew into theories. Some neighbors pointed out that the boy was adventurous but cautious. He was known to dart along the riverbank, but he had never fallen before, never strayed beyond the reach of his siblings' sight. They wondered if he could have slipped away into the trees instead. The forest that pressed close to the water was thick and difficult to navigate, a place where children rarely played alone. Deputies had swept it with dogs and volunteers. But what if they had missed something? A frightened child could hide and stay hidden, even from those calling his name. Others believed it wasn't nature at all. In hushed conversations at the local diner, people recalled unsettling details from that afternoon. A fisherman reported seeing a stranger by the access road earlier that day, leaning against an older model sedan with out-of-state plates. The description was vague, tall, thin, wearing a cap pulled low, but it was enough to stir unease. Another family remembered passing a vehicle on the trail that seemed out of place, parked at an angle as though watching the river. The timing matched the boy's disappearance. Then there were the footprints. Volunteers swore they found impressions in the mud a short distance from where the boy was last seen, prints larger than a child's, pressed deep as if someone had been carrying weight. Deputies photographed them, but rain and repeated trampling by searchers quickly erased their clarity. The images were inconclusive, open to interpretation, but for those desperate for answers, they became evidence of something more sinister than a drowning. As these fragments spread, the boy's case began to fracture into competing narratives. To the police, a drowning remained the most likely explanation. They pointed to statistics, to the river's history of taking lives. To the community, though, the absence of proof felt like proof of something else. The longer he remained missing, the harder it became to accept that the water had simply swallowed him without a trace. Fear grew in quiet waves, that perhaps a predator had been present, someone who used the commotion of a family outing to seize an opportunity. Parents began pulling their children closer, eyeing strangers more carefully, and avoiding the river in the weeks that followed. Within the boy's family, the tension between these theories cut deeply. His father clung to the belief that his son had drowned, a tragic accident beyond anyone's control. His mother resisted that idea with every fiber, convinced that someone had taken him. Their arguments spilled into late nights, fueled by grief and the impossibility of certainty. To her, the lack of a body was the loudest answer of all. To him, imagining an abduction was unbearable, because it meant his son had suffered at someone's hands. The case file filled with notes that led nowhere. Detectives followed up on reports of suspicious vehicles, but each turned cold. They checked registered offenders in the area, interviewed transient workers, and reviewed tips that poured in, yet nothing tied directly to that day. Theories became smoke, shifting shape depending on who told the story, never settling into fact. As weeks became months, the speculation hardened into rumor, and rumor into memory. Some were convinced he was in the river still, lodged in a place no diver had reached. Others whispered about an unknown man passing through town, a drifter who had vanished as quickly as he appeared. A few held on to the image of him walking into the woods, alive somewhere, waiting to be found. Each version carried its own comfort and its own torment. What united them all was uncertainty. Every time the family walked into town, they saw it in the eyes of their neighbors, pity mixed with suspicion, sorrow tangled with fear. Theories had given people ways to explain the unexplainable, but for the ones left behind, they were only reminders of how little was truly known. And beneath them all, the same question echoed louder with time. If it wasn't the river, then who or what had taken him? It was a question that would fester for years, unanswered, until a violent flood more than a decade later forced the river to reveal a truth darker and more complicated than anyone in town had ever imagined. In the early weeks after the boy's disappearance, the family lived in a haze of exhaustion and raw fear. Each day was filled with calls to the sheriff's office, scanning local news reports and waiting for a breakthrough that never came. But as the seasons shifted and the search produced nothing tangible, fear gave way to something heavier. The silence of the case began to fracture the household from the inside. The boy's father clung to the explanation that his son had drowned, that the river had taken him and hidden him where no searcher could reach. To him, it was the only theory that made sense of the absence of evidence. He spent hours by the bank, staring at the water as though it might release what it had taken, muttering that one day it would give him back. His wife, though, rejected this entirely. She believed their son had been taken by someone. To her, drowning was too simple, too convenient. The lack of a body only proved her right. Her conviction hardened with every passing month, leading her into late-night spirals where she reread police reports and begged detectives to look again at strangers spotted near the trail. Their opposing beliefs collided in arguments that grew sharper over time. He accused her of feeding on rumors, of torturing herself with impossible hopes. She accused him of giving up, of burying their son in his mind without proof. The fights became routine, fueled by sleepless nights and unspoken blame. Neighbors who had once offered support began to drift away, unwilling to be drawn into the family's rift. The boy's siblings carried the weight in silence. His older brother avoided the river entirely, refusing to walk past the place where he had last seen him skipping stones. His sister developed rituals of her own, setting aside slices of birthday cake at the table as though he might come through the door and take a bite. They attended school in quiet shadows, their classmates unsure whether to speak of it or pretend it hadn't happened. The absence of their brother was not just a hole in the family. It was a constant reminder that safety was fragile, that childhood could be snatched away in a moment. As the first birthday without him approached, the family gathered in their living room with a cake that no one wanted to eat. A single candle burned while his siblings sat with eyes downcast, listening to their parents argue in whispers about whether the ritual was honoring him or torturing them further. The father blew out the candle quickly, as though cutting off the moment before it deepened the pain. The mother cried in silence, convinced that somewhere her son might still be alive, waiting for her not to give up. The riverbank itself became a place of complicated pilgrimage. At first they visited daily, leaving flowers and toys, pressing their hands into the mud where his footprints had once been. But as months turned into a year, the visits grew fewer. Standing there brought no comfort, only the suffocating reminder that he was not coming back. The father stopped going altogether, while the mother continued alone, clutching photographs and staring into the water, demanding answers that never came. For the children, the river became a ghost, something they avoided entirely, even if it meant walking miles out of their way. The home they once filled with laughter grew tense and brittle. Small things sparked arguments, whether to keep his room as it was, whether to pack away his toys, whether to celebrate holidays without him. His mother refused to touch the room, insisting it remain ready for his return. His father shut the door each time he passed, unable to face the reminders. To visitors, the house felt like a place caught in limbo, frozen between denial and grief. Friends and relatives tried to intervene. Some urged them to attend counseling, to focus on the children still at home. Others suggested memorials, urging them to find closure. But closure was impossible without answers. Every suggestion was rejected by one parent or the other, deepening the divide. The family no longer spoke with one voice. They lived in two separate realities, each convinced of a truth the other could not accept. Years passed in this suspended state. Each holiday, each milestone, underscored the boy's absence. School photos of his siblings showed their growth, but always with the empty space where he should have stood. His name was whispered more than spoken, as though saying it too loudly might rip open wounds that had never healed. The fracture within the family mirrored the fracture within the town. Some continued to believe the river had swallowed him. Others kept alive the theory of abduction, pointing to strangers and shadows that never fit neatly into reports. Neither side could let go, because to do so meant abandoning the only explanations that made sense of a senseless loss. And so, the boy's memory became both shrine and curse. His face lingered on missing posters yellowing with age. His toys gathered dust in a room untouched, his absence reshaping the lives of everyone who loved him. The river remained silent, carrying its secrets beneath the surface. But time, as it always does, was moving toward something inevitable. Nature itself would one day shift, and in doing so, it would force the truth to the surface in a way no one could have predicted. In the aftermath of the first year, the boy's disappearance shifted from an active search to a lingering shadow. At the sheriff's office, the thick file bearing his name was moved from the desk of the lead investigator to a shelf among dozens of other unresolved cases. Updates slowed to a trickle. Detectives were reassigned, resources diverted to newer incidents. On paper, the case was still open. In practice, it had gone cold. The absence of new leads meant there was little to pursue, but for his mother, the silence was unbearable. She wrote letters every month, sometimes to the sheriff, sometimes to state officials, sometimes to national organizations that specialized in missing children. Each letter carried the same plea: do not forget him. Most responses were polite acknowledgments, thin on real progress. Still, she wrote, convinced that constant pressure might keep his name alive. In town, the memory of that day on the river lingered uneasily. For a time, parents kept their children closer, wary of letting them out of sight. Neighbors watched one another with new suspicion. Whispers spread that perhaps the boy hadn't drowned at all. Some pointed fingers quietly at a man who lived alone near the access road, recalling that he had been questioned early on. Others recalled drifters passing through, men with no ties to the community, easy to blame when no one else could be. But no accusation ever led to charges, and soon those suspicions settled into background noise, present but never resolved. Rumors hardened into stories told in hushed voices. There was talk of a hidden predator who might still be out there, someone waiting for the right moment to strike again. That theory haunted parents long after investigators dismissed it. Children who had once played freely along the river were kept indoors. For some, the boy became less a neighbor and more a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly a child could vanish without a trace. Each year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, the family organized a candlelight vigil. The first year, the turnout was overwhelming. Hundreds gathered along the riverbank, holding photos of the boy, offering prayers and sharing tears. By the third year, the crowd had thinned to a fraction of its size. By the sixth, it was mostly family, a handful of loyal friends, and a scattering of townspeople who still felt the pull of that loss. The vigil became less about hope of finding him alive and more about refusing to let his memory be erased. For his siblings, the years of silence carved deep, unspoken wounds. They grew older while the boy remained frozen at the same age in photographs. Teachers treated them delicately, classmates avoided questions, and milestones passed under the shadow of the one who was missing. Each holiday carried an emptiness, each family portrait framed by the absence of a face that should have been there. The mother's refusal to let the case fade became her defining purpose. She kept a binder filled with newspaper clippings, search maps, and handwritten notes. Each time a new detective was rotated into the sheriff's office, she introduced herself with the same plea to revisit the evidence. Some nodded sympathetically, others avoided her altogether, aware they had little to offer. She chased rumors, called tip lines when reports of unidentified remains surfaced in other counties, and sometimes drove hours to speak with officials in person. Each lead ended the same way: dead ends and disappointment. The father, by contrast, withdrew into silence. For him, the years confirmed his belief that the boy had drowned. He stopped attending the vigils, stopped answering questions from reporters, stopped entertaining theories about strangers or abductions. To him, Hope was more painful than acceptance. His wife saw this as betrayal, another rift that widened the gap between them. Their marriage carried on in function, but not in unity, each locked into their own way of surviving the grief. The town itself seemed to move on, but traces of the case remained. The missing posters that had once papered telephone poles faded and tore, a few left behind like relics no one thought to remove. Old-timers still spoke of the boy when newcomers asked why parents here seemed unusually cautious. The river became quieter, less visited, its banks a reminder that something precious had vanished there and never returned. By the 10th anniversary, the boy's name was known mostly to those directly tied to the tragedy. To outsiders, it was just another cold case, one among many that filled forgotten files in county offices. But for the family, silence never felt like closure. It felt like a wound that refused to heal. And while the community's whispers softened, the mother's conviction remained sharp. She was certain the truth was still out there, buried somewhere in the river's depths or hidden in secrets someone had never confessed. What no one could have known was that time itself was working quietly in the background. The river, which had swallowed every trace 12 years earlier, was slowly reshaping its course. Weather, erosion, and pressure beneath the soil were shifting its banks inch by inch. And when nature finally turned violent, it would unearth what people had long believed lost, forcing everyone to confront a truth more disturbing than any rumor. 12 years after the boy vanished, the town was hit by one of the worst storms in decades. Days of relentless rain swelled the river beyond its banks, turning calm currents into a violent torrent that devoured fields, roads, and anything in its path. Emergency sirens echoed across the valley as families were evacuated, bridges closed, and entire neighborhoods sandbagged against the rising water. The river that had once been a place of quiet recreation now became a force of destruction, cutting through land that had stood untouched for generations. When the storm finally passed, the aftermath was staggering. Trees that had lined the banks for decades were uprooted and tossed like matchsticks. Fields lay buried under layers of silt and debris. Roads crumbled where the water had chewed through their foundations. The river, swollen and furious, had shifted its course in places, carving new channels and abandoning old ones. For residents who returned to survey the damage, it felt like the land itself had been rewritten overnight. As cleanup began, small discoveries surfaced that hinted at what the flood had unearthed. Farmers found rusted tools and forgotten fence posts lodged in their fields. Children exploring after the storm stumbled across bottles, old toys, and long-lost junk washed out from upstream. On the riverbanks, twisted roots and eroded soil revealed layers that had been buried for decades. It was as if the ground had been peeled back, exposing remnants of lives lived long ago. Among the locals, there was unease mixed with fascination. People knew the river carried secrets. It had swallowed cars, livestock, and in one tragic memory, perhaps even a child. Some believed the flood might finally bring closure to that lingering wound, while others dreaded what might come to light. The family of the missing boy tried not to dwell on it, though his mother admitted privately that each report of something uncovered near the river made her heart race. After 12 years, she had learned to live with disappointment, but she had never stopped listening for signs. It didn't take long for rumors to spread. A group of workers clearing debris along a stretch of washed-out road reported seeing fragments of clothing tangled in a tree root, weathered and torn by years beneath the soil. Nearby, a rusted frame of what appeared to be a small bicycle was lodged against a boulder, half buried in silt. At first, the findings were brushed off as unrelated, artifacts carried downstream from who knew where. But whispers began to build that these objects were not random. They matched too closely with details remembered from the day the boy disappeared. The sheriff's office, now staffed by a new generation of deputies, took notice. Investigators returned to the site, documenting the discoveries carefully, treating them as potential evidence rather than debris. For the first time in years, the case file was pulled down from the shelf, its faded pages reopened under harsh fluorescent lights. Detectives compared the recovered items against old reports. The bicycle, though rusted beyond recognition to most, bore similarities to the one described by the family. The clothing fragments matched the colors his mother remembered dressing him in that morning. For the community, the effect was immediate. Old wounds reopened. Neighbors who had long stopped discussing the case found themselves whispering about it again in grocery store aisles and at gas stations. Some believed the river had finally chosen to reveal what it had hidden all those years. Others argued it was coincidence that storms always dredged up forgotten debris. But the timing, the location, and the specifics made the connection difficult to ignore. For the family, hope and dread collided in painful ways. His mother visited the riverbank again for the first time in years, standing at the edge of the churned earth, staring at the exposed roots and debris. She whispered that she had always believed the river held answers, that one day it would give him back. His father, who had spent years insisting on drowning as the only explanation, said little. The evidence cut too close to what he had long believed, yet the prospect of seeing proof after so long seemed unbearable. Experts were called in to examine the site. Forensic teams sifted through the mud and debris, searching not only for objects, but for human remains. They marked sections of the bank with flags, bagged fragments of fabric, and collected soil samples. Each step was deliberate, cautious, grounded in the awareness that after 12 years, the line between evidence and erosion was razor thin. As the community watched, one thing became clear. The flood had not only reshaped the landscape, it had reopened a mystery everyone thought was buried forever. The river, once silent, had begun to speak, and with every object it gave up, the question deepened. If these belonged to the missing boy, what else might still lie hidden beneath the soil, waiting for its turn to surface? It was during the second week of cleanup, when crews were cutting through piles of driftwood and mud-slick debris, that the discovery was made. A worker's shovel struck metal, and at first he thought it was just another piece of farm equipment carried off in the flood. But when the mud was cleared away, what emerged stopped everyone cold. Tangled in the exposed roots of a massive fallen tree was a small bicycle, its frame rusted, its chain broken, its once bright paint faded to an unrecognizable brown. The size was unmistakable. It was a child's bike. And for those who remembered the boy who had vanished more than a decade earlier, the resemblance to his last known possession was chilling. News traveled quickly. The sheriff's office sealed off the site, officers directing curious locals away as word spread through the town. Within hours, crime scene tape fluttered in the wind around the eroded bank, and investigators stood over the twisted metal with grim faces. For them, it was not just a bicycle. It was the first tangible clue in 12 years that the missing boy's case might finally yield answers. The discovery deepened when, only feet away from the bike, searchers found scraps of fabric tangled in silt and roots. The material was fragile, discolored by years beneath the soil, but its pattern faintly matched descriptions his mother had given investigators all those years ago. She had dressed him in a striped shirt that day. What remained was only fragments, but it was enough to reignite memories long buried. Forensic teams were called in immediately. Specialists in protective gear carefully documented the scene, photographing every angle before attempting to remove the items. The bicycle was pried free from the tree roots with deliberate care, as if any wrong movement might erase critical evidence. The fabric was collected in sterile bags, each piece treated like a clue capable of rewriting the narrative of what happened on that riverbank. Soil samples were gathered, debris sifted, and the area marked for further excavation. The family was notified before the news reached the public. For the mother, the call reignited a wound that had never healed. She had always insisted her son had not drowned, that he had been taken or hidden, and now the sudden surfacing of his belongings seemed to validate her. The father, though, received the news. In silence, his worst fear of the river confirmed in the most brutal way. To him, the discovery was not proof of abduction or foul play. It was evidence that the river had indeed kept his son all along. As investigators processed the scene, the atmosphere in town shifted dramatically. The case, long considered a cold memory, exploded back into relevance. Reporters returned, setting up outside the courthouse and interviewing neighbors. Theories that had faded into whispers roared back to life. Some believed the bicycle and clothing proved the boy had drowned and been buried in the riverbank until the flood dislodged them. Others insisted the discovery suggested he had been hidden deliberately, that someone had buried his possessions to conceal a crime. In the sheriff's office, detectives pulled the old case file down again, this time with renewed urgency. They compared the recovered items with original descriptions, double-checking every witness statement. The family confirmed the bicycle looked identical to the one their son had received for his birthday, the same one he often rode down to the river. The clothing fragments, though degraded, appeared consistent with what he had been wearing. But confirmation would require more than memory. It would require science. DNA testing was ordered on the fabric, the hope being that even after 12 years, traces of genetic material might remain. The bicycle itself offered little, its surfaces too corroded by time and water, but investigators hoped soil around the frame might hold microscopic evidence. Every item was treated as though it might hold the key to answering questions that had tormented the family and the community for over a decade. In the weeks that followed, anticipation grew unbearable. The family waited for the results with a mix of dread and fragile hope. Neighbors speculated openly again, revisiting old suspicions and recalling details long forgotten. The case dominated local headlines, pulling it from obscurity back into the spotlight. The silence that had defined the years was gone, replaced by a frenzy of possibility. Finally, preliminary reports confirmed what many had already believed. The fabric bore traces of DNA consistent with the missing boy. It was not definitive proof of how he died, nor did it explain why his belongings had been buried so deeply in the riverbank, but it was undeniable evidence that he had been there. For investigators, it was both a breakthrough and a chilling reminder. The river had concealed more than just waterlogged debris. It had hidden the remnants of a child's life, preserved long enough to resurface when nature tore the land open. The case that had once been written off as a tragic accident was suddenly alive again. Detectives who had been children themselves when the boy disappeared now found themselves tasked with uncovering a mystery older than their careers. And as they began to dig deeper into the site, many wondered if the flood had revealed a bicycle and clothing. What else might lie buried just beyond reach, waiting to surface? The confirmation came quietly, delivered in a clinical report that carried the weight of 12 years of unanswered questions. The fabric fragments collected from the riverbank bore the boy's DNA. It was the first undeniable link tying him to that place, the first evidence beyond witness statements and memory. For his family, it was both relief and devastation. Relief that they had not imagined it all, that the objects were truly his. Devastation because the evidence proved what they had long feared. He had never walked away from the river. But alongside that confirmation was something unexpected. As forensic teams expanded their search of the eroded soil, carefully sifting through layers of mud and roots, they uncovered bones. At first, there was a rush of dread. The remains were larger than expected, fragments of a rib, part of a femur, and several vertebrae lodged in compacted earth. When analysts examined them, the conclusion was unsettling. The bones did not belong to a child. They were from an adult. The discovery shifted the case into new, unnerving territory. Investigators had been prepared to find traces of the boy. They had not been prepared to uncover a second set of remains. The condition of the bones suggested they had been there for many years, buried deeply, only to be pushed to the surface by the violent flooding. Early analysis indicated signs of trauma. Marks along the rib suggested sharp force, possibly consistent with stabbing. The adult had not drowned. They had been killed. The sheriff's office, caught between relief at progress and unease at complication, reopened the case in full. Detectives who had only known the boy's name as part of a cold file were suddenly faced with the possibility that his disappearance was part of something larger. If he had been found near an adult's remains, the question was immediate. Had he stumbled into a crime that day? Or had his fate been tied directly to the adult who died? Theories spiraled. Some investigators considered the possibility that the adult was an abductor, someone who had taken the boy and been killed in the process, either by accident, confrontation, or perhaps even by another person. Others speculated that the boy had witnessed violence near the riverbank and had become a second victim, silenced to prevent discovery. The location, hidden for years beneath soil and water, had become less a drowning site and more a potential grave site. Forensic anthropologists were called in to reconstruct what they could. Age estimates placed the adult in their late 30s to early 40s. The bones showed signs of long-term burial in wet conditions, consistent with being hidden near the river for over a decade. Yet no clear identification could be made immediately. Missing persons reports from surrounding counties were cross-referenced, but none matched perfectly. The unknown adult became as much a mystery as the boy himself. For the family, the revelation was crushing. They had braced themselves for confirmation of their son's death, but the discovery of another body complicated their grief with fear. It suggested their child had not simply been claimed by the river. He may have been caught up in something darker, something violent, something human. The mother's long-held belief that someone had taken her son suddenly felt vindicated, but instead of bringing comfort, it deepened the horror. In town, whispers reignited. Theories that had once been dismissed as rumor now carried weight. Residents remembered the stories of a drifter who camped near the river the summer the boy vanished, a man who had disappeared himself not long afterward. Others recalled arguments between transient workers at a logging camp upriver. The idea that violence had occurred in the woods that day no longer seemed far-fetched. But no one could explain how the boy fit into it, whether he had been collateral damage or the intended target. Investigators pressed forward, sending the adult remains to state labs for further testing. Radiocarbon analysis was requested to narrow the timeline. Dental records were compared, though the condition of the skull fragments made it difficult. Each delay only prolonged the agony for those waiting. The mother clung to the possibility that solving the identity of the adult might answer her son's fate. The father, quieter than ever, sank deeper into silence, convinced now that his son's disappearance had been far more violent than he could bear to imagine. The case, once thought closed in all but name, was now something else entirely. It was no longer only about a child lost to the river. It was about hidden violence, about two lives cut short and buried together in the same soil, about secrets the flood had forced into the open. And for investigators staring at the evidence spread across sterile tables, one question loomed heavier than the rest. If the boy had not been alone at the river that day, then who else had been there, and how much of the truth was still buried beneath the earth? The discovery of the adult remains alongside the boy's belongings pulled investigators back into a case they had once considered all but closed. With new evidence in hand, they began retracing the steps taken 12 years earlier, reopening interviews with witnesses whose memories had long since faded. Retired detectives were called in to recount their impressions from the original search. Notes that had gathered dust were reviewed under fresh scrutiny, this time with the chilling knowledge that another life had ended near the river that day. One of the earliest theories to resurface was that the unidentified bones belonged to a drifter. That summer, several transients had been seen camping near the river, moving between logging camps and abandoned sheds on the outskirts of town. Locals recalled a man in particular, middle-aged, tall, unshaven, who had been spotted several times walking the access road with a backpack. He had earned suspicion even then, simply for being an outsider with no ties to the community. When the boy vanished, deputies questioned him briefly, but with no evidence he was released. Not long after, he disappeared himself. Some wondered if he had left town to avoid suspicion. Others now speculated he had never left at all. Perhaps the flood had finally uncovered his grave. Another possibility investigators considered was far darker, that the adult had been the boy's abductor. If the man had taken the child, perhaps he was killed in the act, either by accident or by someone else intervening. The trauma on the bones suggested violence, not drowning. Detectives debated whether the boy could have escaped during a struggle, or whether the confrontation had silenced them both. It was a theory that cast the boy not as a lone victim of the river, but as collateral damage in a crime that spiraled out of control. In the community, old suspicions ignited again. Residents recalled the rumors that swirled in the weeks after the disappearance: a vehicle parked strangely near the trail, footprints larger than a child's, strangers who passed through and were never seen again. These fragments, dismissed at the time as inconclusive, now seemed to gain weight in light of the second body. Parents who had long tried to put the case behind them found themselves gripped with unease once more. If a predator had been involved, had the town narrowly escaped something far worse? Detectives expanded their search beyond the county, reaching into missing persons databases from surrounding states. They looked for men reported missing in the same year, drifters without families, workers who never returned from seasonal jobs. A few names surfaced, but none matched perfectly. The remains provided no DNA link to relatives, no dental records that fit. The adult was still a mystery, his identity erased by time and the river. That gap only deepened speculation. For the boy's mother, the theories offered painful validation. She had spent years insisting her son had been taken, not drowned. The discovery of another victim near his belongings seemed to support her belief. Yet instead of comfort, it left her consumed by new questions. Who was the man? What had happened between him and her child? Was her son simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or had he been targeted? Each possibility was unbearable in its own way. The father, who had once clung to drowning as the only explanation, could no longer deny foul play was likely. The river had not just hidden his son, it had hidden a killing ground. But he refused to speculate further, unwilling to picture the details of how it might have unfolded. His silence became more profound as the investigation reopened, his grief renewed in a form that left him hollow. As investigators worked, the community's imagination ran wild. Some believed the boy had stumbled upon a violent encounter between adults, perhaps a fight between drifters or criminals using the river as a meeting point. Others insisted the adult was a predator who had been stopped before he could harm again. A few whispered darker possibilities, that more bodies might still lie hidden along the banks, waiting for another storm to reveal them. The sheriff's office cautioned against drawing conclusions, reminding the public that speculation could not substitute for evidence. But even within the department, there was unease. The original case had been filed under probable drowning. Now, with the discovery of violent trauma on a second body, that explanation no longer fits. What had once been written off as a tragic accident was morphing into the outline of something far more sinister. And as the floodwaters receded further, investigators knew the river had already spoken once. The possibility lingered that it might speak again, revealing secrets buried deeper still. The final breakthrough came months after the flood, when forensic teams returned again and again to the exposed banks, excavating every patch of earth the waters had disturbed. At first, the search yielded nothing more than fragments of wood and scraps of fabric, but persistence finally uncovered what investigators had feared from the start. Lodged in a section of collapsed soil less than 50 yards from where the bicycle was found, they uncovered human bones, small, fragile, and unmistakably belonging to a child. The location and size left little doubt. After 12 years of waiting, the missing boy had finally been found. Tests confirmed the remains were his, yet the condition of the bones complicated any hope of closure. Several showed signs of blunt trauma inconsistent with drowning. One fracture in particular, across the skull, suggested impact before death. Forensic experts concluded the boy had not been swept away by the river as once believed. He had been buried in a shallow grave near the bank, later consumed and concealed as the river shifted over time. It was an answer, but one that carried darker implications than the family had ever prepared for. The report was delivered to the family in stark, clinical language. To the mother, it was the proof she had spent more than a decade demanding. Her son had not simply vanished into the current, Someone had placed him in the ground, but the validation of her belief was paired with unbearable grief. The image of her child being buried deliberately left her shaken and broken, unable to reconcile the innocence of his last moments with the violence suggested by the evidence. The father, who had lived for years, convinced the river had taken his son by accident, could no longer hold to that story. The truth stripped away the small comfort he had clung to, leaving only the raw reality that their child had met a violent end. Investigators hoped that identifying the adult remains found nearby might connect the pieces. If the boy had been buried near another victim, it could suggest a confrontation gone wrong, or perhaps that the killer himself had ended up dead. But the second body remained stubbornly nameless. Dental records provided no match. DNA yielded no family connection in state databases. The trauma on the bones told a story of violence, but not of identity. Whoever the adult had been, they had lived and died in anonymity, leaving only speculation about their connection to the child. Theories swirled once again. Some detectives believed the adult was the boy's abductor, killed during or after the crime and buried in the same place. Others considered that the boy had witnessed a violent act and was silenced to keep it hidden, his body left alongside the victims. A few suggested the possibility that the adult had been a protector, someone who tried to intervene and paid the price. Each theory carried weight, but none could be proven. The case remained trapped between answers and uncertainty. For the community, the confirmation of the boy's death reopened scars that had never healed. Vigils were held again, larger than they had been in years, as residents gathered to mourn and to reckon with the reality that a child had not been lost to chance, but to human hands. Old fears resurfaced, fears of predators, of violence hidden in plain sight, of the possibility that someone responsible had walked free all these years. Parents held their children closer. Neighbors regarded one another with quiet suspicion. The river, once a place of leisure, became a landscape of unease. The family laid their son to rest in a quiet ceremony. His siblings, now older, stood as young adults beside a grave that should have been dug for an old man, not a child. The service brought a measure of finality, but not peace. Too many questions remained unanswered. His mother pressed investigators to continue searching, to find the link between her son and the unknown man. His father, drained and hollow, said little, resigned to the silence that surrounded the case. In the sheriff's office, the case file swelled with new reports, but no resolution. The river had given back what it once hid, but the story it told was incomplete. The boy's death was no longer a mystery of nature, but of intent. Someone had struck him, someone had buried him, and someone's story remained hidden in the soil. Whether that person was the unidentified adult or another, still at large, could not be proven. And so the case settled again into an uneasy limbo. Not forgotten, not fully solved, suspended between the comfort of answers and the torment of uncertainty. The river had spoken, revealing bones and belongings, confirming violence, but leaving silence where names and motives should have been. For the family and the town, it was both closure and curse. They finally knew what had happened to the boy, but they also knew that the most disturbing secret was not what the river had revealed. It was what it still refused to give back.